Hey everyone, welcome to our first class session, so to speak. The topic of our discussion today is really to start getting at some of the definitions and some of the questions that I want you to be asking now at the outset of the class, but also asking throughout this class. Ultimately, as we move through this course, I'm going to share a lot of information with you about physical activity, fitness, nutrition, well-being, based on the data we have, the evidence we have that's out there. That some of it's going to mirror what you have already learned in your lives from your education, from your families, from social media. And I'm hoping that a lot of it will also challenge some of your assumptions about what's healthy. As we'll get into in this class, we're going to talk a lot about what does it even mean for us to be healthy? How do we define it? And so that's mostly what we're going to dig into today. And all of these questions that I'm posing to you, I'm hoping will continue to come up over the course of the quarter and encourage you to challenge some of the information that's coming your way. Why do I think this? Where did I learn this? Yes, I hear you telling it to me, and it mirrors my own beliefs, and still I want to challenge that. So I invite you to challenge even what I'm saying to you and to use these questions throughout the quarter to figure out, why do we even think that some of the things that we do and some of the things that we eat and some of the ways that we behave are actually health preserving or health conducive behaviors? And on the flip side, why do we believe that some aren't, that they actually harm us? So the first question I'm posing to you is, what is healthy? How do you even define it? After many, many years of public health and healthcare and clinical care with families, so working with a lot with pregnant people, new families, and pediatric folks. So people who are really invested in health optimization, which we'll get into a little bit, and the future generations. It's a super motivated group of people, right? I really want to eat well. I really want to do what's right for my kids. People in the course of thinking about getting pregnant, trying to get pregnant, being postpartum, and raising families are often some of the most invested people in health. But it really always begs the question, what do you even mean? What does it mean to look like having healthy children? For some people, what healthy looks like is that they're clean and they're groomed, and that their outside appearance, at least to the world and to families and at school, indicate that they are being well cared for. So very often health becomes synonymous with care. That's one way that some people define it. Other people define it as, well, if I am healthy, my biomarkers will look good, meaning your lab values, your blood pressure, your weight, your height, your BMI. For people raising families, very often they are thinking about growth charts. In pregnancy, they are looking at potentially at weight gain, or the way that the belly is measuring during the course of the pregnancy in terms of it being in line with where they are gestationally. There's a lot of different ways that we define this, and some of it is with numbers, some of it is with data, because we think those numbers mean something, and we're going to talk a lot about where we get those numbers from and why we should debunk or at least challenge some of those as actually mythical. Some of that is what people think of us, right? That we have equated health with morality. So there is a line, you may or may not have heard this in your life, cleanliness is next to godliness. The idea that having your physical appearance, your habitus, your family as an extension of you, looking clean and healthy is also the way that you are ascending towards God. That you are in closer connection with God, that you are living a more spiritual life. So when we talk about healthy, there are so many ways that people define that. And very often for a lot of us, it's the intersection of those things. There's a little bit of morality, there's a little bit of data and numbers stuff. There's a little bit of outward appearance and avoiding shame. And there's also a lot of the education and then the overwhelm from social media of like, what do healthy bodies look like? So it's a little bit of that shame appearance stuff, but think about how much, I mean, if you were to do a quick search on your Instagram or, with hashtag healthy, and I invite you to do that in this process, what actually comes up? It's very often going to be people who look a certain way. They generally tend to be smaller body, muscled. With men, it tends to be very chiseled and lean, or male presenting people. With female presenting people, it tends to be definitely smaller bodied, muscled, but not too much, right? Can't look manly and be a feminine, healthy person. So there's lots of tropes around gender that are tied into health. There is the way our skin looks. Does it glow? Is our hair long and luxurious? Is it wavy? Is it frizzy? Is it brittle? What do our nails look like? And then looking at the clothes, and almost always those healthy people are laughing merrily while they're eating salad and running, through the park. They very often are white. They don't very often picture, when you Google an image of a healthy person, you're not often going to get a picture of someone who even looks like me, or who may look like many of you. Are we all not healthy people? I beg to differ. But what we believe is healthy, how we define healthy, is from all of these different influences. And so in this process, I want you to keep asking yourself, checking yourself, asking your family members, asking your friends, what do you mean? How do you know that what you're doing is healthy? How do you know that it will equate better health? That's a whole other conversation. What is better health? Do you mean physically? Do you mean avoiding heart attack? Do you mean avoiding cancer? Do you mean avoiding depression? Do you mean sleeping well? Most often when people define health, they very often are looking at physical symptoms or the avoidance of physical pain and suffering, and typically managing their body, as in keeping it smaller for a lot of people, in a way that looks consistent with the imagery that's out there. So how do you define what it is? I want you to get really clear in this process. What is healthy to you? Is it that my blood pressure is 120/80 or lower? Is it that my cholesterol is under 200? Why? Why is that valuable to you? Is it that your BMI is under 30? Why is that valuable to you? P.S. It's super racist and outdated. Why do you think these things are your parameters of health? And this isn't to judge you, but rather for you to become judgmental on some level, critically thinking, challenging toward the sources of your information. And also understanding where that information comes from. We're going to get into this in one of our next questions. Who gets to decide? Who does decide? So when we talk about these numbers, lab values, blood pressure, BMI, and when I say the sidebar of things being outdated or racist, these numbers are not determined with all of us in mind. Lab values, for instance, so like when you get your blood work done and they say, oh, your hemoglobin A1C, a marker of how your body regulates its blood sugar over a 3-month period of time. And specifically what that number means, just to give you a little information, is how glycosylated or damaged or sugared, ultimately, are your red blood cells in your body, such that it's actually causing damage to the red blood cells, or is it a healthy number? And there is some percentage of red blood cells in your body that are going to become damaged and glycosylated over time and with age, with stress, acute illness. And there are reasons why those things happen naturally and normally. And the key is, who made that percentage? On whose bodies were those numbers created? And are those bodies and are those numbers relevant to me? It is very difficult to know as a novice healthcare consumer, health behaviorist, a person who's just starting off in life and trying to create a healthy path. Oh, so that number might not apply to me. How would I know? We just start by asking the questions. Most of these lab values were not created with many of us in mind. They were created decades ago on bodies that were primarily male-born, in certain age ranges and with certain races. Those numbers don't differ globally. And I think that this is a very key thing for us to understand, is that we have started to use medical standards that then we have started to apply to populations across the world with no adjustment for racial, ethnic, genetic differences that might actually apply, that do apply. And that then we see in our, in our context here in the United States, how certain populations then become walking risk factors. Well, maybe our numbers don't actually match who they are. And we're starting to look at that with BMI. We're starting to look at that with blood pressure, that maybe these ranges, well, maybe they didn't actually take these people into account. Newsflash, they didn't. So who gets to decide? Our medical industrial complex is a huge proponent of the data that we use, right? They're a huge generator of the data that we use. The other piece is research. And I think that many of you may already know this or have some sense of this, is that the research is also incredibly biased as well and isn't global in its nature. Now, there are people, I will say that evidence around health and nutrition is being generated all around the world by communities who are also being affected by those results, right? So we're actually seeing a lot of the research that's out there being created in other countries all around the world. Great science. The difference is, in our healthcare context here in the United States, we are not using that research. So we are treating people from those parts of the world in our clinics. Many of you may be subject to this, but we are not using that data to change the lab values, the numbers, and the parameters that we offer people for either you have bad outcomes or you have good outcomes, even though that science is there. So who decides? Well, a lot of that is policy stuff. And we'll get into this much later in the course in terms of how this influences healthcare policy, but I want you to put that aside in your brains too. And lastly, and we learned this through the course of the pandemic in particular, all of our healthcare organizations, World Health Organization, the CDC, big players in the dissemination of health data and health information, they ultimately are the people who have a strong voice, and in some cases, the last voice on what is healthy for us. If you're on this side of a lab value or a number or a piece of data, you're healthy. And if you're on this side, you're not. But those also don't take into account anything related to our sleep, our mental health status, our overall well-being and satisfaction with our life. So when we have those people decide, they are deciding with a very, very, very small data set from us and from all the people around the world. How do we communicate that? Well, we communicate it through research. We communicate it through the mouthpiece of healthcare providers, through healthcare organizations that are responsible for creating policy or, white papers, as they say, that say, okay, this is the new guideline for blood pressure in primary care practice. So very often the way these are communicated is guidelines that come from evidence that is created in certain scenarios and by certain people and validated by certain people through certain channels. What is interesting and what is happening in the last 10 years, and all of you, many of you, I won't make that assumption that all of you, many of you are subject to this more so than was absolutely true for me and my growing up and people of my cohort. Social media didn't exist. The internet was a thing, but not a thing. We barely had email. So the idea that we were going to be learning about health behaviors or health information through social media and other programming was not even a concept, let alone a reality. and the fact that we were going to challenge healthcare institutions, healthcare providers, and their information with social media was also not a concept. So we collectively are living through a really interesting age where we are getting so much information from the quote unquote authorities, and so much information from the people who are saying, hey, but do we trust this information? Should we trust this information? And that in itself has created huge divides and dissonance in terms of who do we believe? How this is communicated has a really big effect on trust, believability, and then therefore outcomes. If we communicate it via social media versus through a World Health Organization white paper, is it more believable? Is it more trustworthy? And are people actually better or worse? Are they sicker? Well, the reality is if we communicate it in a way that people can relate to, they generally tend to have more positive outcomes, period. Who gets left out? Well, for those of you who have taken social dimensions of health in the health studies curriculum, or a social justice and health class in the nursing curriculum, or have been exposed to these concepts, we know that every kind of health definition, every kind of health behavior, and every kind of health communication have people that they are talking to or targeting, and then they have people that they deliberately leave out. When we communicate health risk, we are very happy to include the people who are marginalized in our communities and saying, hey, by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but you're marginalized, and that means you're a walking risk factor. Yay for you. On the flip side, when we communicate what looks like healthy behavior, what looks like healthy food, all the imagery online, who obviously gets left out? Well, people who maybe can't make time for those types of rigorous behaviors. So if you're not lifting heavy, if you're not lifting in a gym, you're not healthy. If you're not running 2 miles a day, you're not healthy. If you're not eating kale and fresh salmon and, capers and, and eliminating carbs, you're not healthy. Who gets left out? Anybody who doesn't have access to those things. And it is fundamentally incorrect that in every single diet, in every single lifestyle, there are behaviors that promote health. And we don't talk about a lot of those things because we are trying to also capture imagery that's very beautiful and attractive to us. But also, we have to consider that people who are not going to be consumers of the food or the product or the healthcare or the active wear do get left out of that programming and that imagery and that health information. And not only do they get left out, like, hey, you're just not even represented here, but they get demonized. Your food is bad. The way you look is bad. Your body size and your body constitution is bad. Is that true? No. But do they trickle into our own definitions and start to affect our own assessments of our health and well-being? Absolutely. Do they affect the assessments of health and well-being of your healthcare providers? 100%. So here we are. What do we do about all this, right? What inspires change for you? Well, I think it is easier to make things personal, to make things individual before we start moving to the global context. So in lifespan development, there's a person called Bronfenner, and he has sort of his circles or spheres of influence. And at the center is always the individual. And then we go to, say our immediate family and friends. And then we go to our society. And then we go to our culture. And then we go to our policies. And then we look at the global and even larger context than us, right? But always at the heart of that is the individual. So when we are considering what inspires change, we have to start here first. What speaks to you? And that's what I want you to ask yourselves today and going here forward. What speaks to you? What actually impels you to change? Is it, if you don't do this thing, you're going to die? Newsflash, you're going to die anyway. Is it, if you don't do this thing, you're going to suffer? By default, as our bodies move through the ages chronologically, biochemical processes change. Parts of our bodies do become slower and break down, and there is a grief process associated with that. So whether that grief appears as suffering to you or not, it does for many people. So even if you aren't physically in pain, there may be suffering that occurs with the simple reality that your body will be very different. Your physical being will be different. Your mental and emotional health and well-being will be very different 20 years from now than it is right now. Does it move you to think about avoiding that? Or does it move you to think about, well, there are certain things I can't control, like death and aging, but I could create or develop skills and tools that will help me manage that as I go. I can cultivate practices now that will actually come in handy 20 years from now. But if I start practicing now, it will be more secondhand to me when I'm 45. Because I'll tell you what, starting to run at 46 years old is no easy feat. It is possible, 100%, but it is a different undertaking. So thinking about not just what inspires change for you right now acutely, but thinking about where do you envision yourself? Do you envision yourself getting old? Do you envision yourself living a long life chronologically? Do you imagine yourself enjoying that life? And if you do, what could move you about that to create something that happens now so that you could live into that experience later? That's one way to inspire change. Versus if you don't do this now, you're going to die or suffer. Both are almost guaranteed. Anyway. So all of these questions are for you to consider now and throughout the class. And I promise you, we will be coming back to them as we go.